the transformation of sexual morality is where the shift from a pre-Christian to a Christian culture is the most radical, the way the Roman world works. It depends if you're male, female, if you're free or slave, if you're a person of honor and status in society, if you're a person who's of low social status or deprived of social honor. There's just simply different rules depending on where you stand in the social order. And Christianity completely changes the underlying logic in ways that make it difficult for us to really get back into the culture of pre-Christian times.
Hello, welcome to Post-Christianity with me, Glen Scrivener.
And me, Andrew Wilson.
We have a very special episode today because we are talking with the professor of classics and letters at Oklahoma University, Kyle Harper. He is the author of this book, From Shame to Sin, which is a sensational work of showing how we've gone from the pre-Christian sexual ethic to a Christian sexual ethic and all that brought along with it. So thank you so much, Kyle, for joining us. We're thinking about a shift from pre-Christian to Christian civilization and what that looks like. And in our episode now, we want to think about sex. Can you take us into the sandals of a Roman, and we might need you to think your way into being different kinds of Romans: man, woman, slave, perhaps even prostitute. If you are in, let's say, the year 60 in Rome, and first of all you're a man, what are you thinking about sex? What is your view of sex and sexuality?
Well, I think that the transformation of sexual morality is one of the biggest effects, one of the domains where the shift from a pre-Christian to a Christian culture is the most radical. And I think most of us have somewhere in the back of our head a certain story, and it may be from popular culture, it may come from movies. I think a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum where the Roman aristocrat orders a sit-down orgy for 40. Or we've been to Pompeii and maybe seen some of the naughty pictures. And so that tends to create or reinforce a story in which, pretty simplistically, pre-Christian sexual culture was all about eroticism. It was fun. It was free. Sex was natural and good. And then the Christians come along and put an end to all the fun. The orgies are closed down. The naughty pictures get locked up in secret cabinets, which does kind of happen. And there's definitely a little truth to that story, but the bigger picture, the deeper truth is that is way too simplistic and not accurate. The question, as you phrased it, is a good one because it's hard for us to wrap our mind around the extent to which, even to think about what the experience of sexual life and sexual morality was like in the first century, is first and foremost a question of who you are. And so in ways that are, I think, as a historian, one of the challenges is, how do you get back into the sandals? How do you get back into the very different world of somebody that lived, in this case, 2,000 years ago? Because we live in a world where, in our popular culture and public morality, if you say there's a double standard in sexual morality, I think everybody would kind of know what that means. It means that there's, different set of expectations, particularly for men and women, that the rules aren't really enforced the same way culturally. And that, the idea of a double standard doesn't even begin to describe the way the Roman world works, because there's nothing at all hypocritical about the double standard. And it's not even a double standard, it's a quadruple standard at least. It depends if you're male, female, if you're free or slave, if you're a person of honor and status in society, if you're a person who's of low social status or deprived of social honor. There's, like I say, there's not even hypocrisy. There's just simply different rules depending on where you stand in the social order. And Christianity, of course, doesn't wipe that away in sort of one swoop, but it radically changes the expectation that different people would follow different rules. It completely changes the underlying logic in ways that make it difficult for us to really get back into the culture of pre-Christian times.
So a quadruple standard then, man, woman, slave, and there's concubinage as well as this sort of second class kind of mistress kind of style as well. You write in your book From Shame to Sin that social standing and this cosmos in which you have a certain place to play and your position within the social order is the all-determining factor. And the Great Revolution is going from a world in which social standing and shame honor is king to a society in which the transgression of like wills and bodies and laws becomes like the transgression. So again, help us if I'm an ancient person. There are still norms about sex. It's not a free for all. Very, very much not. But what is determining who is fair game when it comes to sex? What is ruled in and what is ruled out? What are the rules?
Well, you mentioned concubinage, and I think that's a helpful way to think about some of these questions. And instead of taking an abstract ancient person, we can take a very specific ancient person, a well-known late Roman figure named Augustine, St. Augustine, Augustine of Hippo, one of the most extraordinary human beings who's ever lived, and a person that we know more about than anybody who lived in the ancient world, mostly because of his own writings, and particularly because he wrote a book called The Confessions, in which he confesses to God many of his sins and tells the world about what a bad sinner he'd been. It's pretty amazing portrayal of his own past. And so, because of what he tells us, we can learn about kind of his life and the way that this culture, the world around him, which is still, when he lived in the 4th century, he lives from 354 to 430. The world is changing from a pre-Christian to Christian world. And concubinage is a social practice. It's a relationship that is inferior to marriage between a free man, usually of higher status or wealth, and a woman who doesn't have social honor. So probably in most cases, concubines are freed slaves. And it's a practice that develops because men, particularly high-status men, tend to marry late, into their mid to late 20s, even 30s. Augustine isn't engaged until he's in his early 30s. And so that's a long time between puberty and marriage. And it is completely acceptable, even expected, in some ways even encouraged, for Roman free men in their teens and 20s to have sex, usually with slaves or prostitutes. But one form of this is concubinage, in which there's just a long-term sexual relationship between two people of very unequal status. And Augustine amazingly tells us that he was in a relationship with a woman who he doesn't name. We don't really know that much about her. She was probably of low status. It's not a marriage because Augustine will get engaged for a socially appropriate marriage after he's in Milan. And he does have a kid. You're not supposed to have children in concubinage. And in general, when you do, they're not recognized as legitimate children. But Augustine does have a son, a Deodatus, with this woman. And when Augustine gets engaged around 30, he sends this woman packing. He clearly is attached to her in certain ways, but it's concubinage. And so it's a relationship whose purpose is sex. And famously, because Augustine's engagement is to a woman who's not yet eligible to be married, he doesn't want to go without sex, and so he buys another one. He says, "Procuravi alium." I bought another one, meaning I bought another woman. And it's really, I mean, obviously, it's kind of horrible how the exploitation is at the heart of these kinds of relationships. But there's a very particular individual who tells us, more or less in his own words, about the experience of a society where if you're a free man, you do have limits. This is not a world where people date and have premarital sex with other free, socially honorable women. But it's a world where it's simply expected that people without protection, people without social honor, whether they're slaves or they're in brothels, are exploited. And so that's a kind of concrete story that we know a lot about, but it's really just reflective of this world.
How do you, as a historian, you've used the word like horrible exploitation there, which like we all hear that. You describe that story and we all hear horrible exploitation. But is there a sense in which we hear with 21st century ears horrible exploitation? And to what degree do we have to go back to the 5th century and kind of hear with ancient ears? It's like a contemporary of Augustine. Is he thinking that's horrible exploitation? Or you know, like they're processing things in different ways, aren't they?
Right. They are. And I mean, every society has its field of vision, has its blindness. What's amazing, obviously, we should say that for the most part, we tend to know the ancient world through the eyes of the literate classes who write things down. You know, we see and don't see what they see in many ways. That said, of course, we can read against the grain, and I don't think, you know, I think the world of antiquity would look very different if most of what we had been written by people who lacked power, people who were bought and sold, who were traded as commodities. And so I think it's important that we try and look at this world from the different angles, whether it's the text that we have and thinking about what they say, but what they don't say. What's interesting is that in the 4th and 5th century in particular, as Christianity becomes the public culture, Constantine converts in 312, more or less during Augustine's lifetime. Christianity goes from being a minority religion to a majority religion, to where most of the society is at some level, at least nominally, and many cases more deeply Christian. That's a sea change in religious history and social history. And one of the interesting and I think kind of unexpected consequences of that is that for the first time in a lot of ways, you start to hear different voices, new voices. You start to see new problems. And in many cases, Christian bishops are very, very critical of the social system around them. And so they're critical of it from different perspectives. They're critical of the what they perceive as the sinfulness of people who are having sex in ways that they shouldn't. So they're critical of people like Augustine. He's, of course, critical of himself. That's kind of the point of confessing it. But what's maybe even more interesting is that this opens the door to see, for them to criticize these kinds of systems, these structures of exploitation, in ways that recognize the dignity, the claims of people who are exploited. And so there are at times expressions of concern and speaking in behalf of the dignity of people who are kind of getting the bad side of these systems of exploitation. And this does even, in some ways, translate at times in limited ways, but does translate into changes in social practice, changes in systems and structures, changes in laws. And that's one interesting domain where we can actually follow some of these changes. Christian emperors in the 5th century start to get concerned with the practice of prostituting enslaved people, and take public legal action in the name of suppressing it. So it's an interesting change because it's totally different from the Roman world that had preceded it.
So you talk a lot about the fact that sex begins to be seen not only from the perspective of the powerful person, but from the powerless person, or the dignity of the weaker person, and which is all related to the idea of consent and a lot of things we now take for granted. What's the connection? How arbitrary would it have seemed to an ancient person that Christianity was saying you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that? Where does it grow from? What are the roots of that idea that you should see it from the point of view of the other person and the dignity of that person? Where has that come from at a sociological level? It's partly theology, I'm sure, but where does that come from, and how much does it feel like a random thing that's just come in? This is now what the new faith teaches us, and how much is it sort of more organic than that, and it's become part of the way people think about the world?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's a great question. It's a big one. I'd say there's at least 3 or 4 things that are going on that are swirling together to create this deep change. I mean, one is the fundamental locus of the Christian Gospels, as well as Pauline letters, that provide a different set of normative beliefs. And so that, in this instance, has sort of 2 different facets. One is the kind of radical egalitarianism that is potential in the gospel and in Paul's writings, and that does cut across the social assumptions, the world of hierarchy and status of classical antiquity. And second, sort of essentially scriptural ingredient is the kind of heightened energy around sexual morality that really comes more from the Pauline letters, particularly from 1 Corinthians, more so than the Gospels. There's elements of it in the Gospels, but it's particularly Paul, and particularly the letter to the Corinthians, that ultimately makes sexual ethics kind of front and center in Christian morality in a way that it really wasn't. And if you read Epictetus, who's an amazing Stoic philosopher, he doesn't have that much to say about sex. I mean, it's there for sure, but it's not kind of all that strict, and its place in the overall just texture of his moral teaching isn't extremely prominent. Whereas for Christians, it assumes a kind of centrality that's unexpected. So you have a kind of combination of sex is now an important domain of morality. 2, you have a kind of egalitarianism where everybody kind of counts. Everybody is creating the image of God. And this is whether you're a king or a slave, you count. But the third ingredient, I think, is what I mentioned earlier, is the conversion of a society. Because when Christianity is a persecuted minority, it has the kind of stridency of a persecuted minority. It's sort of outside the mainstream. And sociologically, as you were putting it, that's a very different environment than when all of a sudden you have bishops who are some of the most important leaders in their cities, and they're grappling with large communities where you have a huge array of different kinds of people, different statuses, different professions, different levels of earnestness about their religious commitments. So it takes the kind of moral ingredients or theological ingredients, but it does take that sociological ingredient where all of a sudden you have Christianity as a mass movement, as a mainstream factor in society that I think leads to a different kind of reflection that we haven't seen before. And so simply when I was writing my book on this question, the nature of the Christian sources in the post-Constantinian period are just so dramatically different than what we had before. And it's not that the beliefs are different, but what they see is different. The way they interact with society is different. You get leaders like Augustine, but his rough contemporary in the East, John Chrysostom, who's a priest in Antioch and then bishop in Constantinople, and who's an amazing preacher. And we have hundreds of his homilies. And that they're an amazing source for everything we're talking about for social history, because you have this extremely eloquent, very thoughtful, very honest, very socially critical preacher who's preaching to probably hundreds of people and dealing with, thinking through the kinds of problems that really exist in the world around him. And, when I was way back in the day writing a dissertation on slavery in the late Roman world, you kind of fall in love with these sources because, of course, you're desperate for good material. You're like a journalist, you want a source. And you can get a little attached to your sources. I probably like John Chrysostom too much just because he gave me so much good material. But that's in itself is kind of the interesting fact. What is going on? Well, all of a sudden you have a society that is now mostly Christian in some sense, and these leaders have to grapple with problems that maybe they didn't before.
Mm-hmm. And before then, before the church becomes this sexual sanatorium, as you call it in the book, for all the sinners of the world.
Did I say that?
Yeah, it's brilliant. You got some great lines in there. You talk about how, all the world's diffuse erotic energy is to be cramped into this one frail sacred union, which is just a sensational line. And as a counterculture in the early church, that kind of flies in a certain way. You've got this odd breed of human called a Christian, and some of them are even martyrs, and they can kind of buck the trend of survival and embrace death. And then some are virgins, and they can buck the trend of sexual self-expression, and they can actually be continent, and chastity suddenly becomes this sort of superhuman thing. But when you kind of roll that into an empire-wide exercise, there start to be some different views of freedom. Like we've already talked about Augustine. In the early church, you talk about free will was born in the struggle to define the meaning of Christian sexual morality. And in my reading, that was because you had this brand of human being called these Christians who were kind of bucking the trend of absolute biological necessity and doing this completely different thing. And a libertarian kind of doctrine of free will suddenly seemed much more believable for Christians in the early church. And then that changed as we went sort of post-Constantine. Have I read you right in any way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets at what I find really interesting is that the question of free will becomes suddenly very prominent in the 2nd century, the Roman Empire, in a way that it simply hadn't before. And there's some interesting debates about whether it's essentially Stoic, and there's some arguments that are compelling to that effect. But ultimately, I think what's very interesting is, to me, indisputably, it's Christians who really take that banner, and they're the first ones to use the words together, free will. So just like as a point of just empirical fact, as a kind of really linguistically even, but it's not just that they're the first to use the words. It's that this idea that humans are fundamentally moral creatures in a cosmos where morality, where our moral nature is fundamental, is essential to who we are, and that humans will be judged, really sharpens the contours of beliefs about freedom of the will. Because in that kind of high stakes universe, when you combine it with the sort of egalitarianism that all people are like this, and all people matter, then you see sharpened the notion that consequently it must be the case that all people are free, and they're free in a moral sense. And so to me, there's an explosion of interest in this in the early Christian church that you don't see in Platonism, where it could have developed. You don't see in Stoicism, where it could have developed. And in both of those cases, in some ways, is in the air, is implicit. But it really pretty clearly is Christian thinkers who are very vocal, very insistent that human beings have a certain moral nature, and part of that moral nature is the freedom to choose whether to sin or not. So it's interesting because then it gets entangled with sex, because, as I said, sex is also more front and center in Christian ethics than it had been in other philosophical systems. So it's those two things start to sort of rotate around one another. And of course, this then in the later post-Constantinian church it becomes inescapable that Christians have to then confront, what about the people who are fundamentally unfree in a legal and social sense? And so you see all of this come together in the fourth century, where they're grappling with the links and tensions really between the philosophical and the social.
Yeah. And as one of those categories of people who are unfree and sort of brought into the sexual arena, where I'm thinking about pedarasti here as something that was celebrated. And there were different forms of it in the Greek world and the Roman world. But I guess it was Jews like Philo who first kind of wrote it. Were there any sort of detractors from pedarasti sort of prior to Philo writing, and then so how do Jews and then how do Christians kind of conceive of pedarasti?
Yeah, I mean there are, but it's certainly by the time of Philo's first century AD Alexandrian Hellenistic, deeply Hellenized Greek speaking Jew who's a prominent social figure as well, very interesting philosopher, influenced by Platonism. And so one of the reasons why it is suddenly more visible in Philo is because he wants to synthesize Platonism with his kind of Hebrew moral foundations. And so that of course sort of poses the very specific tension between the prominence and often positive valence of certain kinds of same-sex eros in the Platonic corpus for Philo, because he wants to praise Plato and integrate it with Jewish moral thought, but that's sort of a point where he doesn't reconcile them. But you see him critical of pederasty in particular. Like you say, there are different forms, and we're talking about a huge sweep of time. So many people will be familiar with the Platonic dialogues, and personally, I think the world of classical Greece, and in that case, we're in classical Athens, is quite different from the world of the early Roman Empire in lots of ways, culturally, socially. I think for me as a social historian, what I think is most fundamental probably is just the way in which slavery becomes so fundamentally important in the Roman world. Of course, the Greeks have slaves, but when Plato's talking about same-sex attraction, it's usually between free people. When most of the authors in the early Roman period, early imperial period, write about, moralize about same-sex attraction, it seems like slavery is always there. And so this is a world that does have very different beliefs about same-sex love than Christianity or more modern cultures. But it does seem that slavery sort of takes over or is always present. So when if a free person in the Roman world wants to have same-sex homosexual sex, they almost universally, the sources that we have, which definitely isn't reflective of everybody in a huge, complex, diverse society, it seems like, again, this slavery is always central, and a lot of what seems to take up the space in these conversations is conversation about masters exploiting their slaves. So you see that sort of change over the centuries from classical Greece to classical Rome, and it's a very different world. And when the Christianity spreads and spreads and spreads, it's in a world where, again, slavery is really central to cultural conversations about same-sex attraction.
Right.
Can I ask how unique is this transition? How dependent is the modern, well, the sort of post this sexual revolution vision of sexuality? How dependent is it on Christian foundations once it's the revolution having happened? Do you think? I mean, part of my question, because I'm just interested in this in ordinary life now. When you take away the theological foundations, which are all the things you talked about, the sort of, if you were to one by one remove the bricks, when would the house fall down? Or rather, how unique, or perhaps another way of saying it is, how unique is this transition? Does it happen in other cultures and civilizations in a completely different way? Are there other sources that get us to this more consent-led, respect the dignity of the individual, no matter who you are and how honorable you are in society, you still have similar sexual rights and restrictions? How could that have happened without Christianity, or did it happen without Christianity in other parts of the world? Or is it all effectively an exported version of the Christian sexual revolution that takes place in the period you've been talking about?
Well, why don't you ask a big question? You tell me. I'm just a Roman historian. I think that there seems to me to be something that is deeply, essentially Christian, certainly about the way this revolution happens. But it really, the values of consent and dignity and the way those become fundamental ingredients in liberalism seems to me deeply Christian. And it's a good question. That's the right question, is does it happen elsewhere? Could it have happened elsewhere? I think we can certainly imagine ways in which other really deeply moral philosophies, if they become public morality, could tend towards these kind of fundamental values of consent and dignity. But I do think that those are in many ways, the really key terms, the really fundamental values that in many ways separate the pre-Christian from the Christian world of antiquity. And I mean, I think that's just in the sources. There is absolutely a notion of consent in Roman law. They're not oblivious to the meaning of consent, but it's a very muted idea. It's certainly not front and center. Whereas in Christian culture, that becomes a really important concept, that either a person does or does not consent to certain acts. And then dignity, again, this is rooted right in the sources. It's Christian bishops in the 4th century who are really shouting. You don't have to look that hard to see them talking about the dignity of the individual. You can find traces of it in pre-Christian systems, certainly in Stoicism, but you have to look really hard. Whereas, the axioma, the worthiness, the dignity of humans who are created in the image of God, who have freedom, moral freedom, who have a rational soul, that's really loud, and it's really prominent in a way that it hadn't been before. So I think the way this transformation does happen, it's in very Christian terms.
So something like Me Too, would you say has been a profoundly Christian kind of movement? Harvey Weinstein transposed into Rome. His crimes would be invisible, in that sort of society. And would you see that Me Too is testament to something Christian still clinging on in modern Western society?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could argue that. Obviously, it deserves emphasizing in a way we haven't touched on yet that there really is something anti-erotic about the Christian Revolution. So just to start with language, I'm old-fashioned and do think we could ask what do the sources say. It's pretty stunning that Eros is not present in the New Testament, right? It's agape, which is a pretty marginal term until the New Testament. It's a pretty weird word. And there's just something really deep about that Eros is not there, and agape is everywhere. So it's a different, fundamentally different model of love. And we have to, of course, keep in mind that early Christianity is a deeply ascetic religion. And so, I think in many ways what's going on in modern times is that there's the notion of consent is still prominent. Egalitarianism is still fundamental, but there's also a kind of renewal of the positive charge of Eros and its connection to individualism and expressivism in a way that is not indebted to the early Christian revolution. We have to remember, what Paul says in Corinthians is that marriage is permitted, but he says by way of concession, not of command. He says, I wish all could be as I am, meaning celibate. And the big debate in early Christianity is whether marriage is a secondary good to celibacy or a lesser evil to sin. This is a live debate right down to the time of Augustine. He writes a book called On the Good of Marriage. And he writes that because it was a big issue and a debated issue among Orthodox Christians into the 4th century, whether Paul had let Christians get married just because it saved them from porneia, from fornication, this kind of sin. So I do think it's helpful to emphasize the really deep ascetic tendencies in early Christianity that's, again, embedded in the Gospels, in the Pauline letters, and that is worked out over the course of centuries. But the question is even whether Christians should have sex at all, even within marriage.
Yes. And therefore, expressive individualism and romanticism kind of comes to the fore, and the erotic is back with a vengeance. This has been so helpful, Kyle. Thank you very much. You've got some teaching to do today.
Gotta go teach.
Yeah, got to go and teach all that.
So helpful, Kyle. Thank you, and thank you for your work. It's wonderful on this and on pandemics and others. It's been really great to talk. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful.
Well, thank you, guys.
So, what'd you make of that?
It was fascinating. I think you're so struck on him. He's a remarkable thinker and a very warm guy, and it's just really a real privilege and joy to have him on. I love the duality in a way of clearly what a modern person, and I think he would probably represent this himself, would affirm about the Christian Revolution, which is and he kept going back to those two prongs really of sort of the dignity and the egalitarianism. So the sort of the social leveling that takes place through Christianity and then the individual dignity, which of course together feed the concept of consent and that being at the heart of the way that we think about sex ever since. But then also the critique, that which a modern person would say, which has obviously not come from Christianity, which is, Eros bites back, or that kind of, I just think that comment towards the end about Eros and Agape is so helpful. And so in a way from the perspective of any modern person, any modern Western person who's not a believer, or I can't say that now, can I? Not a Christian believer anyway.
Yeah.
Looking at the Christian vision of sex, they may only have, the Christians will see the dignity, consent piece of the puzzle, and the non-Christian will probably see it's a bit erotically repressive thing. You're not just sort of you're not celebrating Eros as you should. And actually, of course, both are present in the Christian Revolution. And I just thought that analysis, particularly at the end, of Eros and Agape together, the asceticism of early Christianity, even as a way of understanding what our culture thinks it's recovering in challenging Christian sexual mores more recently. Right. Because I think it helps you read our own culture and say, okay, you are building on these two Christian insights, but you're also, from your perspective, without recognizing it, you are, but you're also restoring, as you see it, a sort of celebration of the naked joys, literally, of Eros, as opposed to the agape-centered vision of Christianity. And that tension between, of course, we're going to assume these things to be true, #MeToo, but we're also going to celebrate all of this stuff and go crazy with whoever you like. But effectively then try and constrain it simply with the category of consent and effectively use that as the only rule you have, which is why people would still say to any two consenting adults, knock yourselves out. And I just think that was, as a way of analysing it through the lens of Eros and Agape, was a very helpful way of framing it.
And it certainly makes you think harder when somebody says, well, love is love, don't you think? And you're like, well, part of the problem is we're speaking English, and which Greek word are you meaning?
Because Agape as Eros, don't you think, clearly doesn't make any sense.
I hope not. Yeah. And there are at least 4 loves that, we it's not storge, it's not philia, but so that is fascinating. And this idea that sex as a breaking of rules and norms and a violation of something that stands above the social strata that we're in and is just wrong if it's abuse. It just comes across so strongly that, even as Kyle Harper is talking about the ancient world, he can't help but say, well, that's exploitation.
Yeah.
And that's horrible exploitation.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, okay, we've been thoroughly Christianized in that sort of way. And yet those sorts of categories were invisible to that culture.
They were. And
were brought about through the Christian Revolution. And the other thing that struck me is I quoted that line to him, which I'm always talking about the all the world's diffuse erotic energy was cramped into this frail sacred union. And in a sense, the 1960s kind of let the genie out of the bottle again. One way of telling the story is that the first century sexual revolution said men must be as restricted as women have always been. Yeah. And it attacked the double standard from that level.
Yeah, and the 20th century one's the opposite.
Now women can be as liberated as men have always been. But then you get the Louise Perrys of this world saying, well, but now everyone has to play the male game.
Yeah.
The male-dominated game.
Exactly.
And men, on average, have different desires.
Social sexuality is much higher, and therefore tendency to promiscuity is higher. People find you've got far less at stake in your sexual proclivities than a woman does, because you're not going to give birth to a child at the end of it. And so the whole sexual economy gets designed around effectively powerful men.
Yes.
Which I think, again, sorry to keep toggling back to the 18th century, but that's, of course, one of the things that's going on even in the modern sexual revolution is that it's really, the 1960s is really the going mainstream of trends that were 200 years old, really, that people from the 18th century beginning to go, well, of course, men can do this, this, and this, and challenge all these Christian sexual restrictions more and more. In fact, you see some of that even back in the time of someone like Shakespeare or John Donne or people like that. And then it becomes certainly something that powerful men can do. And what happened to the 1960s is then it sort of snowballs into the culture as a whole after a series of little mini sexual revolutions rumbling away in the 20s and so on.
And then the technology shock of contraception.
Exactly, and it then makes it easy to do it without the downsides or the consequences, at least as it's framed, and so it becomes a much more widespread phenomenon. But at its heart, at a sort of ideological, conceptual level, that change has already been made, but it's just still got huge costs for certain people. And what happens today is we pretend that those costs no longer exist. And even through a mixture of contraception or abortive, whatever, we are trying to go, no, there's no downside, there's nothing to see here. And pornography is not, it's a sort of consenting person and a consenting viewer, and what's the problem? And as you say, I found Louise Perry very helpful on that. And she's not the only one saying it, but it's very helpful to think, no, there are a lot more acts of exploitation and destruction. It's one of the reasons why abortion would be sidelined so much. And we don't want to see it, don't want to talk about it, don't want to be aware of what it is even. And it's certainly why we wouldn't even want to have a conversation about contraceptive methods and some of the victims in pornography, because it's to put back in the center of the screen the fact that there is still exploitation going on. There is still the powerful and the powerless. That dynamic's still there. And there remains, therefore, a tension between Eros unchained and consent and dignity. And that is effectively built into the way we are. Because if I have sex with anybody I want to, that's sometimes going to have destructive consequences on those people. Similarly, if I don't, I am constraining my own sexual freedom. And of course, the Christians have said yes to the second of those. That is what you should do. And the 1960s wanted to say no to those things. But we've seen what happens when that overreaches and eats itself. So, yeah, I just thought it was a fascinating interview.
And wasn't it fascinating that he said that sort of libertarian free will was born in the struggle for the early church to express itself in chastity?
Yeah,
actually,
I was really interested because I've not heard that before. I didn't know, actually. I feel bad that maybe I should have known this. Maybe you knew it. But the idea that Christians were the first to even use the term free will. But the fact that is actually a big part of the sexual story, because obviously partly free will means I, powerful male, can control my desires.
Yes.
But it also means that you, subservient in society's eyes, slave, woman, child, have free will, which means you have agency to resist me. And so the free will cuts both ways, both times in defense of sexual restrictions and consent. And I'd never seen that.
Yeah.
That was a bit of a light bulb.
Yeah, freedom is expressed not in free love in the 1960s sense, but in the sense that I'm free from a necessity.
Yes, I'm not a slave to my sexual passions.
Right, yeah. And so actually virgins and martyrs in the early church are teaching a fatalistic culture.
Yeah.
You can resist the biological urge for survival and sex.
Yeah.
You can be a martyr.
Yeah.
Be free, be a martyr, be free, be a virgin. And therefore, I think
that could be Virgin Atlantic's next campaign. But yeah, it is that was a very interesting. I guess I'd seen it on one side, but not on the other as well. I hadn't thought free will as a category for understanding that sexual revolution's fascinating.
And then, I mean, where the book gets to gels very nicely with Joseph Henrich and the weirdest people in the world. And Joseph Henrich writes in a more direct kind of way. So where Kyle Harper talks about all the diffuse erotic energy being cramped into that frail sacred union. He talks about the church reached down and grabbed men by the testicles, right?
Yeah.
And for the absolute blessing of the West. And Kyle gets into it, and obviously Joseph Henrich's whole book is about that. But that actually unleashing free love in the erotic sense has been a dangerous, wild experiment.
Yeah.
But constraining especially male sexuality, has been for the blessing and fruitfulness, of the world. And you see people like Louise Perry and Mary Harrington and others sort of rediscovering that.
You do, and it would be interesting to see maybe in 100 years' time an equivalent podcast of this could look back at the impact of that on some of the wider sort of economic and political fallout of the sexual revolution, so if you chain male sexual energy you constrain it is probably a better, slightly less pejorative term, but you constrain it and you channel it into this particular way, these are some of the benefits that have come as in Henrich's work, as you say. But the opposite is also true, that if you just allow it to run amok with anybody, any which way, you wonder, so what are some of the economic impacts of what that does to families and what that does to male identity and what that does to female identity and what it does to fertility, and therefore what it does in the end to the health and civilization and the aging of a society and demographic trends, and the future belongs to the fertile. You realize all of these things are actually offshoots of the demographic transition and the sexual revolution that is connected with it. And you wonder, in 200 years' time, would people look back at these generations we've lived through and say, oh, that was when things really started to go wrong for the West, because that was where the actual things that make the society strong, although they still had a lot of money, but actually now we can look back and see that was where it started to go wrong, because effectively they gave up on those things in order to allow sexual desire to go wherever it wanted again, and it backfired. Who knows? Obviously, it's too soon to say, but I think you can see some hints of some of those trends, very well established as of the early 2020s.
And final question, like what does it make you think as an evangelist and an apologist into this culture? Because I think if we wound back the clock 15 years, I wouldn't want to talk about sex and all that kind of stuff. I would say it's a totally fringe issue. It's all about Jesus. And there might be a chapter at the end of the book in a little FAQ section about it. And yet, I mean, what Kyle was saying is in the first century, front and center, people were like shocked by how much Christians were wanting to talk about this issue. Are we back in that kind of culture where sex becomes more prominent?
I think we are. I mean, when I first started preaching in 2005 or 6, I mean, we did a series called Sex in the City. You know, it was it sounded on trend at the time. It doesn't now. Based on 1 Corinthians 5-7. And it was one of the first major series I did, and sort of late, I guess in my late 20s. And I actually realized the apologetic power of, even then, of 15 years back, of preaching into sexual ethics as a means, partly of engaging attention, partly it's one of the things that the world is still going, I am interested in talking about that subject. I don't share your presuppositions about it, but I definitely want to talk about it, which is not true of many areas of biblical theology and ethics. But simultaneously, I think what you realize how Christocentric the Christian sexual apologetic is and has to be if it's to make any headway at all. Because the more post-Christian society becomes, or the more leaving Christianity behind society does, the less easy it is to just give people the rules, and the more you have to show people the theological grammar within which the rules make sense. So you have to go to Ephesians 5, you have to go to Genesis 1 and 2, Revelation 21 and 22, because people otherwise say, yes, but why is that the rule? Why do you limit sex in that way? Why is sex within marriage? And you start telling the bigger story of Christ and the church, of heaven and earth being united, of the worshipping one God rather than many and having one sexual partner who's not like you versus many who might be. And you have to tell those big stories in order to make any of it make sense. But that, in a way, then means that you're able to use sex and marriage as an apologetic tool. They become, you're leaning into them because you realize this is actually an opportunity rather than something I'm hoping never comes up.
Right.
And that's certainly been my experience. You occasionally get into trouble as well. But I think it enables all sorts of openings for gospel conversations that would probably not have been available at the start of the century. And I think, again, I'm always the optimist, but I think there's lots of opportunities there in what I call sexual apologetics. I think it's a great gift to us.
I agree, and I think the apologetics of the early church would sort of bear that out if we see how they address the topic. Well, that'll do for now. We are also going to, in our series, interview Carl Trueman as we look at how we've gone from a Christian to a post-Christian kind of sexual ethic, and he'll have plenty to say, the author of The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. That'll do for now. Andrew Wilson, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Glenn.